Well, and I would say, when you're talking about the different groups that need to be involved, just think about something like if I want to change packaging to compostable packaging, right? Uh, I think it's a good thing to do. But then I have to get finance on board if it costs a little more.
Totally.
And what if marketing thinks, well, this is a little more opaque. This doesn't look as good as virgin PET that I want. You're using compostable and or it's thicker because it needs to be a thicker
Or,
material to be able to withstand
or it's brownish, right? If it's a
yes.
paper.
Yeah. So all of these, I mean, you're talking about quality assurance, you're talking about marketing, very, very important stakeholder, legal, R&D. Everybody's got to get on the same page and sing from the same sheet, like you talked about.
Well, no, absolutely. And uh, you lead me to start to think I work for some large corporations in high tech. But you got me to think now that we are at the point where we have to think about the internal structure of the corporation. Because this kind of collaboration, you can be for 20 years the chief marketing and you don't talk to finance, except that you need a budget. But it's not the deeper discussion how you can help with sustainability, for instance.
Yeah, structure matters, but also the way you align is incentives. So you can't,
Absolutely.
you need to do it at the top. First of all, commitment at the top and say, this is something we need to do. And yes, you need input. If marketing's concerned, you need to hear it. You can't ignore any department. But once it's everyone's had their voice and the company says and leadership says, this is where we need to go, then you cascade so that everybody has a piece of what's important of you to obtain. And that's the only way to get the cascading of, whether it's management by objectives, long-term incentives, even praise and awards and things like that. What are you praising in your business? What are you rewarding people for? Is this important or is this something on the side that you just report on? It's got to move into the center and it's got to be aligned that the organizations know, yeah, I really want the best cost and I'm going to try to save money here. I don't want my margins maybe to erode, but I also need to know that this is important. And maybe through doing this, I can get better employee retention. I can, get more customer buy-in, whatever it might be. You're looking at all of the aspects that can bring value versus just one department's
You,
aspect.
you you brought something from the beginning. You talked about culture and incentives, and of course, we can analyze the incentives in uh, different types of capitalism, right? There is the American flavor with short-term incentives. There is the European flavor with deferred incentives, at least in some large companies. So, there is a lot to learn from both organizations, let's say. But also there is a need for cultural change. And you mentioned it. And I see the cultural change also as adaptability. If you want your company to survive, if you want it to thrive, if you want to be resilient, you cannot do it short term. I was joking with my colleagues and I say, I have your solution if you want to be short term. Fire all the R&D. Nothing will happen for 3 months. I can guarantee you. Because it takes 1 year, 2 years, 3 years to get a product or a major change. So sure, R&D in the short term, it's a cost. Why should you put 20% of the finance or the cost in the R&D?
That's a great example. And I think there's a lot of areas training. You could say the same thing.
Sure,
So I just
training.
need to cut training. I'm not going to help. And it's just, again, all of the issues morph and become bigger because you didn't do the things that seemed like they were just a cost.
Yeah, you can cut also the vacations in 3 months, no vacations, right? So you have 100% efficiency in terms of working hours.
Yeah. And I always say that. So if you're as a company and every industry is different profitability margins focused, right? It's easier for some, maybe if I'm a tech company, I don't have some of the issues I might have as and I'll talk about supply chain, low margins for distributors, right? There's not tons of money there. So, so you have to look at what you can
Sure.
do within the industry. Uh, but really being able to have that culture that says, this is important. I can't kick the can. I can't say it's the
Yes.
next person's issue. I need to address it. And if that means I have to do something else structurally to my organization, as you mentioned, maybe I need to do that to be able to long term obtain these goals, make a difference, and secure the resources I need longer term.
Absolutely. And back to the positive way to look at it. Once you look positively at sustainability, at supply chain, the changes, the nearshoring that you mentioned. No, once you start to look positively, you discover opportunities. And if you look at it as being a cost, another cost, it's very simple. The CFO will minimize it, right? To look at all the items and say, okay, can we do 20% less on this and this and this, uh, like compliance? And we see this even as a trend in sustainability regulation now in Europe, for
Mhm.
instance, where they say companies came back and say you cost us too much, instead of saying, well, help us to make it profitable.
Right. And I think, there's a lot of ways to look at the regulation, but in some ways it levels the playing field. So if only one person's going to do it and that makes them less competitive from a cost perspective, and then they have to have higher prices, there's plenty of research that says some more consumers, if you do the right marketing, the younger consumers in particular, sometimes won't even buy from certain companies, or if they have certain practices. So, there's value there, but when you get the regulation, it does level the playing field. And that's what I think you've seen. I mean, the EU has been on the forefront of saying, okay, we really have to address this. And so different disclosure requirements, they're getting at the issue of how do you level the playing field. And we're seeing that
And
some in the US, but it's more state by state at this point.
it is, which in some way can increase the price of the cost of regulation as
Yes,
opposed to
that
decrease
makes it
it because,
harder.
yeah, the, I keep saying California is now the fourth largest economy. Do you want to do business in California if you are in another state or not? And if you do business in California, you comply with California legislation. There is no if or buts.
Yes. And you're correct in that saying that it can be more costly. We have many examples. I came again from food service, and when they wanted to do the calorie labeling as an example, if New York wants to do it one way, California, no, that's very costly for a company to try to manage all those different rules. It is actually easier as long as, again, input is provided, small businesses accepted based on their footprints and abilities and things like that. But to have one standard rather than to have all these different standards you're managing.
Absolutely, absolutely, and makes it actually more costly to the consumer at the end. At the
Yes,
end, somebody is called the consumer and pays at the end of the whole chain. We talked about it.
yes.
Um, and you talked about strategy. How do you see, and let me maybe summarize because you already, I think, touched on this topic. It has to start from the top. It has to start not only with simple, marching orders, let's call them, but also they have to start with a longer term view
Hmm.
from the top with a culture of adaptability as opposed to be just a culture of just in time, right? We, we,
Yes.
we we deliver these quarters and we hope for the best for the next one, but let's not think about it yet.
Yeah, I think some of whether it's strategies or best practices, we've talked about the alignment and the need for that.
Yes.
Also, the collaboration with your partners. And when I say partners, that's very broad, customers, suppliers, etc. You talked about something about, and I'd like to sort of uh, pull on that thread about structure of an organization. So what I also think a great strategy or best practice is rather than taking sustainability and setting it aside, you need to embed it within the organization so that someone with power, if they have the name, I head up sustainability and global X, like
Absolutely.
there are resources, there's power there. And same with if I have someone who does, for example, sustainable sourcing. So they're really focused on maybe certification of certain areas, or they need to be in the middle of the procurement organization, not set aside reporting to a director of sustainability who doesn't know the function.
Absolutely.
So I think the structure you build is another best practice to say, I have actually given this resources, a place within the organization, and it's not set aside. It is embedded.
E-
And then
e-
another strategy and best practice would be measurement. You
abs-
need to set the goals, you need to align people, but then you need to be able to measure the progress. And that's hard in some cases for organizations, particularly the medium and small size organizations. But you've got to wrap around metrics somewhere in here to be effective, to know where you're moving.
if we dip a little bit in the history, I think, I don't have a proof, that a lot of the heavy legislation came as a result of greenwashing. And greenwashing was moving the goalpost, right? Okay, today we reduce 20%, but no, we reduce only 5, but next year we'll reduce 25, so we'll catch up, and
Yeah.
so on.
I think that's a good observation. I think the greenwashing, we're piloting this, and that's great to share pilots. But the question is, what are your results? What are your impacts in total? So
Exactly.
pilots are fine to have, but you've got to be able to report on, lots of different, and we can talk about KPIs, but lots of different metrics that people can get their arms around. And you've got to be honest when you don't make them. And that happens. Some companies are really good um, and at reporting, haven't made this goal by this date. And here's why. And here's
Yeah,
what we're going to do. Because you don't
the
hit every
remedial,
goal.
the remedial. No, actually, setting stretch goals, it's a good way to manage companies because otherwise, if you set conservative goals, like that that actually makes the company eventually stalling.
Yeah. So it's okay to maybe miss them, but then was it because it was aspirational? Was it because something happened? I mean, we've had a lot
Well,
of disruptions and issues that are realistically have created new costs, new burdens, and things like that. But being able to pinpoint that and say, how do I get back on track? And is this still the right metric? And I'm going to look at it over time.
and that can be brought down to every employee and every participant level. Essentially, she or he can have a goal and a stretch goal. I'm going to take at least 1 week of training this quarter,
Mhm.
but my stretch goal is to find time to take, an online course, for instance, as well.
Yeah, that's a nice example. And I think having that, I would agree, stretch goals are important. Organizations need to really push forward. And so it's fine to do that. If you want to motivate people, you don't want them to be so stretched that they can't get there because then they'll just, there's a whole thing. And I'm not HR, so I won't get into all the incentives. But I do think it's important that people can bring it back to their functions. So if I'm, sometimes because, the focus is, of course, heavily on emissions for understandable reasons. But that can seem 50,000 feet to some employees. Like, what do I have to do with missions? So being able to break it down and say, I care that you're helping us do composting, that you're putting it in the right bin, that matters, and our accuracy there matters. And or I've come up and I'm doing more recycled content for packaging. You've
Right.
got to put it in terms that are a little more granular or micro so that people can absorb it and say, yeah, I can get behind that. I understand what my role is.
From a process viewpoint, we also started to look at how to introduce sustainability at the beginning of the design process.
Absolutely.
Because I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term MRD, Market Requirements Document. It's pretty common in high tech. And we started to look at, we issue a white paper which is called MRD, SMRD, Sustainable MRD. And we put it in the design requirements. We communicated to the product team, to the development team, and sustainability continues step by step in the process. And as you said, some are stretch goals, but the awareness of the design team, we felt that sustainability is part of this core function, as you said, not an add-on. It's not only because we need to report or we need to, at the end of the year, to issue a sustainability report.
Yeah, and if you think back to what I was saying about supply moving into the design phase, that's where we can inform, well, how readily available are these suppliers? Are there risks with these suppliers? Is
Sure.
there a new material that I want you to consider because we're seeing it come up here? And, if we could do this, or maybe can you design something that I could substitute two products?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Harder
And
maybe, but or I can make it more repairable by making it more modular.
absolutely, it's another sustainability goal, circular economy. We have a lot of business terminology for essentially the same thing. Save energy, save materials, use whenever you can use simpler materials. And this is where this virtuous supply chain plays a role.
Yeah,
I
and
know I'm sorry.
no, I was
Uh,
going to just say that, yeah, the whole life cycle piece is so important to make sure your employees, partners aren't just looking at like only end of life. But then how can I bring that back to the design phase to make end of life better, a better outcome? Longer
Absolutely.
usage, whatever it might be. Again, components that can be taken apart and sorted as opposed to something that's stuck together and no one could ever recycle it. But that's what someone wanted because it looked good.
Absolutely. Or it's recycling, it's an afterthought and it's practically, it's technically possible, financially impossible.
Yes.
So it's, no, and do you have maybe some KPIs in mind? Let's say for a moment you were advising the CEO of one of the Fortune 50.
Yeah. Well,
What
certainly,
KPI?
yeah, I would say certainly emissions is there, but I think that's already being handled. I think things like if you have your own fleet or even if you're using 3PLs or whatever, tracking the percent of the fleet that can use or uses renewable energy. You could look at pounds of supply chain materials that are recycled. So if you're using shrink wrap on your pallets, if you're doing other things, can you start to measure that the materials that you use in the supply chain process that can be recycled? Um, you can look at percent of sustainably sourced products, and they don't all have certification, so you have to be careful. But you can pick a category, and it could be for wood or paper, Forest Stewardship Council, right? Or some, there's lots. So if you're in, depending on the area, there's different groups that might do this for ethical sourcing or just good practices. And so if you begin to measure that and say, I have a goal to get to 50%. Let's start looking at the metric. Well, we're only using 30% today that has this certification, right? And even if you think about, so much in supply chain has trucking is a large part of it. So empty miles driven. Can you reduce the empty miles driven through better coordination, better routing, backhaul, things like that, that will just help efficiency that you're not just driving with a truck that has nothing in it, right? Water consumption, of course, energy consumption, those are pretty basic but important because if you don't know your consumption and maybe compare it to another like area of your supply chain, maybe one distribution center against another and say, oh, wow, we use a lot more water here. Why is that? Maybe one, and I'll give you a small example, the best practices if they're cleaning an area before maybe using water to wash it, along with their chemicals and things, depending if it's inside, outside, maybe they're dry brushing to do the first thing, so
Mhm.
less
Remove
water
the
is,
exactly. No, don't
uh,
use water as a brush, essentially,
right,
high pressure
right.
water.
Exactly, exactly. But maybe one doesn't know that's a best practice. So a lot of this is sharing amongst your operations as well in supply chain. So, but metrics help you see things, right? Those
Absolutely.
measurements would tell you, wow, the water usage is a little different here. Why? And then you can get to the root cause and dig down and say, wow, there's different practices going on here. Or my goodness, we had leaky pipes that we had no idea this was flowing out and nobody's been repairing. What's our maintenance schedule? What are we doing on a regular basis? This one does
Or
maintenance.
how we measure the change in flow, even, before maintenance. How do we measure the changes and we react to change? That's back to the culture as well. Absolutely.
Another one I would put out there, I think particularly today, is percent of returned goods. Because we know how environmentally um, negatively impactful the percent of return goods. Many of them end up in landfills either because it's too hard to repackage, the cost of the
Or
reverse logistics, all of that. If you could just drive that number down by, I mean, lots of different ways. I've had students study this on their capstone. I've seen some really great
yes,
suggestions, but measure that. Do you measure it? Hopefully they are, and then drive it down with planned
I mean,
actions objectives.
there is another side effect. Even if you sell them as a discount, they get put on a shelf. So essentially, the usefulness of the product is zero. You know,
Yeah.
it's one example would be fast fashion, right? Which essentially just creates the desire but not the use.
Right. I really, well, if fashion has struggled, right, with some of these issues of, you know, and this, I would say the issue of quantity gets to this whole issue of we can't just source, make, use, dispose, and do that at large scale and say that's how we get a great economy. We've got to rethink what creates great.
Well, reserve it for the next opportunity to discuss because we're getting into the area of GDP growth. Should the economy be just measured on growth? The same with companies, right?
Yes.
ROI.
Big discussion topic, but that alone, as you know, can create a lot of issues, both with societal issues and environmental issues, if that's the only metric.
I would want to ask a quick question before the final question,
Sure.
which is how do you see AI playing a role in the social part of sustainability? It's very good to help with things which are measurable, but we always have a problem to measure social and stakeholders, right?
Yeah, I actually think I'm bullish on how AI can play a role. And let me also say, I think AI, like everything else, there's two sides to the same coin, right? So we have bad actors, we have potential people who will only use it for reducing uh, workforce and economic gain. I think we have to look at it and say, how do we also get environmental and societal ROIs from AI, not just the
Absolutely.
economic. But there's ways, if you think about it in supply chain, first of all, AI can really help with visibility. So
Hmm.
through doing tracking and tracing, it's wonderful there. And so you can do things like, can I lower recalls because I have now better traceability? Can I eliminate modern day slavery because I'm able to find it more easily? So very many ways that it can impact societies. If you think of analysis, and we talked about different materials, the testing that has to happen, I'm not an engineer, but for those of my colleagues who are, I know what it takes to do some of this, whether, no matter what field you're in. If AI can help you do it faster and say, I think these are the combinations that will work, these are the things that are less toxic, you can rate them. That is an amazing analysis that can be done. So discovery, optimization, scenario analysis are all things that AI can help with. And then auditing, where I think it can be helpful, think about autonomous drones being able to look, well, who's coming in, or are people, how, and you've got to be careful with privacy and other things, but they're already used in you know, drones, I should say, already used in insurance and many, many industries now. Um, and if we can use them to help with visual audits that we just can't get to, and if you think about it, so they can do visual inspections, you can even have, AI can sense smelling or smells.
Absolutely. No, you
So,
bringing the example of the natural gas pipelines and the
yes.
leakage. And
Mm-hmm.
exactly, they smell, they
They smell.
capture the, chemically, and they can. So this is an example of positive reinforcement. Now you also reduce the leaks, and you reduce the contamination of the with greenhouse gases, with carbon
Absolutely. And
footprint.
safety. I'll put that up there too. There are things that are not super safe that humans have to do. Well, if we can
No,
get autonomous, intelligent robots to do them, that's a safety piece too. So I think
absolutely.
there are so many angles, whether it's through the analysis, whether it's through just having them do certain tasks. And then I would do one other area I would think about with AI is just communities and employees being able to empower them more. So you, again, I've used the term level the playing field when I was talking about regulation, but here you may have communities that are more dispersed or people who can't get to some of the education that now through AI, they will be able to get some of that. I think that is wonderful. And that has the potential, again, if we're not only focused on how do I just milk this to get efficiencies, and
Yeah.
I think the societal environment, you could just keep going with the ideas of what could be done.
No, thank you. And before we depart, I wanted to ask you a question about what would you recommend to new grads? What do you recommend to new grads and to professionals that are in the mid-career and they change to sustainability, to supply chain, and so on?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have many students interested in sustainability in our program, and we have some that are actually practicing in it. They're doing sustainable sourcing, et cetera. But it's a growing field. It's an important field. So I think understanding that is important. But you need to become not just an expert in sustainability, but an expert in your business to make an impact. And this gets
Ah,
into the alignment. So you want to be in the conversations, in the decisions, and to do that, you got to know how your organization runs, what's important to them, how can you create value. You can't just stand outside. And so my advice would really get to know how the business operates and figure out how you can weave in sustainability and make it a better operation as well.
so thank you. I would say maybe the conclusion is don't be just part of the supply chain, be part of the value chain.
Yes, great way to sort of wrap that up.
Until next time.
Very good. Thank you.
And I would like to thank you for taking the time to visit with us today. I want to make sure that for everybody to tune in every week for a new episode of Actionable ESG by KFI. And you'll gain new perspectives on how to mitigate risks and how to create value by integrating ESG and digital transformation, and specifically today in the supply chain, being an orchestra or being a sports team, both are valid. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Linda.